Now, in terms of political, the politics stepping aside, that's a decision that's made partly in the hope that in deferring to military security, there will be a resolution that does not require further politics. And of course, that doesn't happen. And in the meantime, there was politics going on while the security operation was taking place, which also broke off. So in some respects, what occurs is that the sort of civil relations that dominate, obviously domestic conditions, are taken over or set aside when the military is called in. This can create a lasting sort of bubble effect. And I use the reference to 9/11 because culturally, socially, politically, there is a sort of an aftershock of that event, which is then, for some people at least, in the securitization field, is harnessed for further militarization, securitization. Now, it's true that episodic movement of militarization requires the right kind of event, and Oka is not the right kind of event for that advance, and that's what this is what I'm trying to say with Oka. It is exactly an illustration of how those people that are talking about militarization, where those stoppers of militarization might be. There's a cultural stopper to militarization when you have a sovereignty dispute like this.
In reference to your question, I must say that, well, they are my findings and the findings from the publications that you've mentioned are pretty similar, that in this sense that especially the benefits, yeah, they were sometimes treated as, well, the way to well, to boost enlistment, yeah. Those who were enlisting were promised that dependents' benefits are going to be a large part of the addition to their, well, payments, and later on they were arbitrarily cut down because an Indian agent in a given area could say that, well, the costs of life are lower here, so you don't need that money, and well, it should be either paid to a special savings account, or sometimes they were left to the disposal of an Indian agent, and nobody actually was able to track that money. So, in this respect, yes, I do.
What do you think that the Canadian Forces as an organization can learn from the New Zealand example? Do you see any specific ways in which they can make changes to replicate some of the successes of the New Zealand system?
Thank you. So in the previous study was actually a comparative study between the New Zealand system and the New Zealand and the Canadian military system in terms of what the different organizations are doing. And so I think the biggest difference is that whereas in the Canadian society and is sort of based on a different paradigm where we consider ourselves a multicultural society, and our indigenous people are not necessarily seen as a partnership. And I think so that's a different foundational paradigm for New Zealand, where the Maori people, after many years of colonization, so they haven't come to this place very quickly, but are now in more recent times seen as partners of the non-Maori, the Pākehā. So I think that's it. So we're starting with a different paradigm as a society. That paradigm then is replicated in the military. So again, in the New Zealand Defence Force, there's a bicultural policy, and that's replicated in each service. Then the culture of the New Zealand Indigenous people is integrated with various type of programs and types of activities, so starting from language training and culture training to the actual artifacts, so the marae in each, in the basis of the different services. So, whereas in the Canadian military, we're doing more of, you know, trying to attract the Indigenous people to the military. There's no real need to do so in New Zealand. They traditionally, historically, they have a high propensity to join. So we are starting from different places as a country. And the activities and the initiatives that they're doing in New Zealand are therefore a little bit different. Having said that, you know, could we aspire to borrow some of these best practices? And in the paper I argue that yes, we can, but it should never be done with a quick fix. It should never be done with a, you know, one size fits all. In particular, because in Canada, we have more of a diversity within our Indigenous population than they do in New Zealand. And so we need to acknowledge that diversity. Not everybody is a status Indian. We heard from the general, there's a very, very diverse Indigenous population in Canada. So that needs to be acknowledged. So there's no quick fix. There's not one size fits all. So I think we need to, you know, we started with these programs. It's a very good start. But as you saw, the numbers, for example, for the Alloy program at RMC are not very high, right? So maybe there's something different that we need to do, but it should never be, and the other thing that I say in the paper is we don't get a second chance to gain local trust. So it should be done right the first time, it should be done slowly, and we should be well informed and educated before we start anything. While I was in New Zealand, there were demonstrations going on. So I think the relationship between the Indigenous people and the government is never like a perfect one. And so there's frictions in New Zealand, just like there are in Canada, just like there are in other parts of the world. A lot of them are you know, related to land and the environment. And so those frictions are always going to be there. Now, whether or not a New Zealand soldier can participate in an active demonstration or not, I'm going to guess not. But I am not, I'm not from New Zealand. I'm not a Kiwi. I said that at the outset. I'm not Indigenous. I am telling a story as objectively as I can. I'm going to guess they're not allowed to, just like our soldiers would not be allowed to, just by the virtue of wearing a uniform and working for the government.
The first, maybe the most problematic part of the Bosnian-Weaver securitization concept was the prolocutionary act, the act of the reaction of the audience to the securitization attempt. So I was just interested in how you tackle, if you use that model, how do you tackle the prolocutionary act part? And the other part is, I'm interested in media and public opinion. So when you showed up the headlines of different media, I'm always interested to know if that kind of opinion was reflective of public opinion in Quebec in general, or if we saw more support for the Canadian Forces action after these headlines. So did it have an impact, or were people still already convinced that the Canadian Forces were doing a great thing in Oka, or were the media instrumental in fostering that support?
So there have been some people that have looked at that, like Lackenbauer and others, who have looked at the media response to Oka, looking at Winter is another one who's done it, James Winter, and the conclusion is that the Canadian Forces were very effective in presenting their strategy to the media, and the media, where for the most part, the print media, for the most part, was initially at least very compliant in providing that message. Those messages were provided. Indeed, they gave them video to append to their stories, which is always helpful for media. Media always like to have some video to attend. So that was very effective. It was considered to be quite an effective strategy, and it was remarked upon at the time by other journalists to be very effective. However, there was also a counter view because journalists weren't permitted to go behind the lines, and this created some dissension, and also the phone lines were cut off. And so that created quite a lot of dissension from the media organization spokespeople as well. In the first instance, it was considered to be quite effective. Later, as I mentioned, some of the other forms of media weren't as supportive of the CF. Some of the information that came from behind the lines, there were a couple of reporters that managed to stay behind the lines and provide counter narrative reports of what was going on. For example, the banner "Lasagna Dead Meat" was provided by those media behind the lines. And so that, of course, had an effect of a counter-narrative that was presented to a wide audience. With respect to securitization, I really very narrowly use Balzac, and the reason I do it is because of the relationship between security and uncertainty. So just to quote his line again, security discussions only happen when there are questions about the current state of a polity, that is, when there is a form of uncertainty. In trying to intuit why security is dealt with or not addressed in the way it is, we need explicitly to engage in the management of ambiguity, since the difficulty of speaking security owes something to the ambiguity that always looms in the background of security talks. And so I'm resting it on the idea that security emerges in places where there is enough ambiguity about a resolution that provides the window for basically securitization. Now, as I say, that is only a temporary window and doesn't work in all circumstances. And so this is OCA is a perfect example of where one can be a bit too ambitious about thinking that the march of securitization, the march of security is unstoppable or a juggernaut. And I think OCA provides a good illustration of where there are firm, well, one might almost say firm stoppers to that march of both militarization and security.
It's primarily to Garcia, but Magdalena, you might want to address it as well, and it's about gender. Can you talk a bit about the experiences of women? Has it been different for Maori women in the New Zealand Defence Force? Any stats about the numbers? One of the great photos you had up there, it looked like there were some women doing a poifire, the welcoming dance. Were those service women, or are those just other Maori women they brought in? And if there's anything about women veterans, I'd be interested to hear that as well.
I can tell you that I haven't specifically sort of disaggregated my information by gender for this paper or for the other paper, but what from my observations there are some differences in the Maori customs sometimes for men and women, and it is a little bit observable to a non-Maori. However, it doesn't seem to cause any kind of friction within the military. So I don't have those stats by gender, I'll tell you that much. But again, I think there are cultural norms that are part of Maori culture that might be a little bit different for men and women, and that's what I observed, but I don't have the stats for that, sorry.
As far as, your question is concerned, during the First World War, I think there was just one, woman of Aboriginal descent who was in the, nursing service. And during the Second World War, I think there were at least 20 women who, from the reserves, who actually decided to join the military, also usually in either nursing service or certain auxiliary services. So it was like a tiny proportion if we compare to male enlistment.
Did they ever come up with that?
I mean, they were given the same privileges, even though I haven't found any documents which would confirm that any of them would like to apply for Veterans Land Act. I mean, within Veterans Land Act.